The digital clock on my secondary monitor read 2:15 in the morning. I was 55 years old, operating on 3 hours of sleep, and staring down a server cascade failure in Chicago that was bleeding Nexus financial data exactly $95,000 every single hour. My name is David Lawson, and I was the senior infrastructure engineer keeping the entire payment processing ecosystem alive for 20 major banking institutions across the country. I had spent the last 30 years of my life building, maintaining, and rescuing critical systems from the brink of disaster. But tonight was shaping up to be a completely different kind of nightmare. The Chicago data center was completely unresponsive. It was not just lagging or dropping packets. It was entirely offline. Every single second that ticked by meant thousands of declined transactions, locked accounts, and furious clients. My wife, Sarah, had brought me a cup of black coffee around 1 o'clock before heading back to bed, knowing better than to interrupt me when my terminal windows were flashing red. I had diagnosed the root cause within the first 12 minutes. A misconfigured routing table had triggered an endless loop, essentially choking the network to death with its own traffic. The automated failover mechanisms, which were supposed to seamlessly redirect traffic to our secondary hub in Denver, had failed. Why? Because someone had deliberately disabled them during a maintenance window 3 days ago. I was meticulously typing out the manual override commands, executing a delicate digital surgery to force the traffic over to Denver without bringing that cluster down too. It required absolute precision. One wrong keystroke, and I would paralyze the entire North American transaction grid. My shoulders were tense, my eyes burning from the harsh blue light of the monitors. That was exactly the moment my phone lit up with an incoming text message. I ignored it. 10 seconds later, a second message arrived. Then an email notification popped up over my primary terminal. I glanced at the preview pane, expecting to see a frantic check-in from our operations director. Instead, it was an email from Richard Vance, the newly minted vice president of operations. Richard was a textbook corporate climber, immaculately tailored suits, zero technical comprehension, and an ego that required its own zip code. He had spent his first 4 months at Nexus trying to justify his exorbitant salary by slashing operational redundancies that he deemed unnecessary. The message read, "David, we need to discuss your contract situation immediately. Call me." I stared at the words, blinking to make sure the sleep deprivation was not playing tricks on my brain. We were losing $95,000 an hour. I was the only engineer actively mitigating the crisis, and he wanted to discuss my contract. I kept typing, completing the final sequence to stabilize the routing protocols, and picked up the phone. "Richard, I am in the middle of a critical outage," I said, keeping my voice low so as not to wake my wife in the next room. "Can this wait until morning?" "No, David, it cannot," Richard replied, his tone dripping with the kind of smug authority that only comes from deep insecurity. "Human Resources was supposed to notify you on Friday, but there was an administrative oversight. I am calling to inform you that your contract expires at 7 o'clock this morning. We have decided not to renew your position. We are moving to a managed service provider to handle infrastructure going forward. Consider this your courtesy notification." The sheer audacity of the man left me momentarily speechless. I looked at the clock again. It was 2:22 in the morning. He was firing me in less than 5 hours, right in the middle of a multi-million-dollar infrastructure collapse. "Let me make sure I understand you clearly," I said, my voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of emotion. "You are terminating my contract at 7 in the morning today?" "Your contract is expiring," he corrected quickly, as if the semantic difference mattered. "Your access to all Nexus systems will be revoked precisely at 7 o'clock. I looked back at my screens. The manual failover was about 60% complete. The bleeding had slowed, but it would take at least another 3 hours of constant monitoring and micro-adjustments to fully stabilize the Denver cluster and bring Chicago back online safely. If I stopped now, the cascade failure would overwhelm Denver by dawn. "Fine," I said calmly. "I will notify the technical director that you will be personally taking over the remediation of this crisis, seeing as my access will be revoked and I am no longer obligated to work beyond my contract terms." There was a profound, beautiful silence on the other end of the line. The reality of the situation had finally pierced through Richard's thick skull. "What is the current status of the outage?" he asked, his voice suddenly sounding much smaller. "Actively being resolved by me, the contractor you just fired," I replied. "I suggest you wake up your new managed service provider. They have exactly 4 hours and 38 minutes to learn an infrastructure that took me 4 years to build." "David, let us not be hasty," Richard stammered, the smugness completely evaporating. "The contract situation is a formality. We can discuss temporary arrangements in the morning." "I need an email in my inbox within 15 minutes, I stated, typing a final command to push a batch of transactions through the bottleneck. "That email must confirm my employment status, explicitly authorize my continued access, and guarantee compensation for emergency response work at triple my standard rate. If I do not have that email by 2:45, I am logging off, and you can explain to the board of directors why their transaction grid is still offline." I hung up the phone before he could respond, and the next 20 minutes felt like a lifetime. I continued to work, my fingers flying across the keyboard out of sheer muscle memory. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was highly focused. I had spent 3 decades in this industry, and I knew exactly how ruthless corporations could be. The difference was that I was not a junior engineer who could be easily intimidated. I knew the value of my skills, and I knew exactly how much trouble Richard was in. At 2:40 in the morning, my phone buzzed. An email from Richard, copying human resources and the technical director. It met every single one of my demands: a temporary extension of my contract, authorization for emergency access, and the tripled rate for the current incident. I smirked, saved a copy of the email to my personal secure drive, and went back to saving their multi-million-dollar business. By 5:30 in the morning, the crisis was fully contained. I had brought the Chicago servers back online, re-enabled the failover protocols that someone had foolishly disabled, and written a comprehensive incident report detailing exactly what had gone wrong. The root cause was undeniable. Richard had ordered the failover testing suspended and the automated redundancy disabled to artificially reduce our cloud computing costs for the quarter. It was a classic, short-sighted executive maneuver to hit a budget target, and it had almost cost the company everything. I documented every single detail, attached the network logs, and sent the report to the entire executive team. Then I closed my laptop, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a second cup of coffee. Sarah walked in a few minutes later, tying her robe around her waist. "You are still up?" she asked, taking one look at my face. "Was it bad?" "It was catastrophic," I told her, leaning against the counter. "And Richard tried to fire me in the middle of it." I recounted the entire phone call. Sarah, who was an attorney specializing in corporate compliance, listened with a growing expression of disbelief. "He terminated your contract while you were actively engaged in emergency remediation?" she asked, her legal mind already analyzing the liability. "Did he give you any prior written notice?" "Nah. He claimed it was an administrative oversight." "David, that is not just poor management. Depending on the terms of your contract and the nature of the emergency, you could argue a breach of the covenant of good faith and fair dealing. And if his cost-cutting measures deliberately compromise the data security of financial institutions, he might be bordering on a breach of fiduciary duty." "I know," I smiled, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "That is why I made sure the incident report was airtight. He cannot hide from the logs. But for now, they are bringing in a managed service provider this morning. They want me to do a knowledge transfer before my extended contract runs out at the end of the week." The managed service team arrived at the office at 9 o'clock that morning. 2 young guys, probably fresh out of a boot camp, looking eager and completely out of their depth. Their names were Jason and Tyler. I greeted them professionally and led them into a conference room where I had prepared a massive stack of documentation. I had spent the last 2 years documenting every quirk, every legacy system, and every customized script that kept Nexus running. It was over 400 pages of highly technical, incredibly dense material. "So, we are supposed to take over the primary infrastructure support?" Jason asked, looking at the binders with wide eyes. "That is the plan," I said pleasantly. "Nexus processes transactions for 20 major banks. The architecture is a hybrid cloud environment with localized legacy databases that require manual synchronization every 48 hours. If the synchronization fails, the transaction queues back up, and you have about 20 minutes to clear the cache before the entire system deadlocks. Tyler swallowed hard. Is that automated? No, I replied truthfully. Richard rejected the budget proposal for the automation software last quarter. It has to be done manually, via the command line interface, using a very specific sequence of commands. It is all documented in Section 4, Paragraph 12. I spent the next 3 days burying them in facts, figures, and technical realities. I answered every question honestly and thoroughly. I did not hide anything, nor did I exaggerate. I simply presented them with the raw, terrifying truth of what it takes to maintain an enterprise-level financial network that has been systematically starved of resources by an incompetent executive. By Thursday afternoon, Jason and Tyler looked completely defeated. They had realized that the streamlined, modern infrastructure Richard had promised them was actually a complex web of band-aids and manual interventions. Richard called a meeting on Friday morning, my final day. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes betraying his stress. The technical director was there, along with human resources. David, Richard began, attempting a conciliatory smile. The service provider has indicated that they might need a slightly longer transition period. We would like to retain you as an external consultant for the next 60 days to provide escalation support. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. I appreciate the offer, Richard, but my consulting firm is currently quite busy. If I were to take on an emergency escalation contract, my rate is $250 an hour, with a guaranteed minimum of 20 hours per week, plus a 4-hour minimum for any after-hours calls. Richard turned pale. That is extortionate. That is more than triple your original salary. That is the market rate for a senior enterprise architect providing mission-critical emergency support, I countered smoothly. You can accept the terms, or you can rely on Jason and Tyler to handle the weekend synchronization process on their own. It is entirely your call. The technical director quickly intervened, approving my terms on the spot. I walked out of the building that afternoon with a massive pay increase and total control over my schedule. The consulting arrangement was highly lucrative and incredibly satisfying. For the first 2 weeks, my phone rang constantly. The managed service team, despite their best efforts, simply lacked the institutional knowledge to navigate the idiosyncrasies of the Nexus network. Every time a legacy database stalled, or a custom routing protocol threw an error, they panicked and escalated the ticket to me. I would log in from my home office, diagnose the issue in 10 minutes, fix it in 5, and bill them for 4 hours of consulting time at my premium rate. Richard was absolutely furious, but his hands were tied. He could not complain about the cost without admitting that his decision to transition to the managed service provider had been a catastrophic failure. By the 3rd week, the technical director bypassed Richard entirely and called me directly. David, this consulting arrangement is bleeding our department budget dry, and the board is starting to ask questions about the increased downtime incidents since you left full-time status. We need you back, not as a contractor, but as a full-time principal architect. You name your salary, and you will report directly to me. Richard will have zero authority over your position. I negotiated a base salary that was 30% higher than my previous contract, full benefits, and a severance clause that guaranteed 6 months of pay if my employment was terminated for any reason other than gross misconduct. I returned to the office on a Monday, much to the visible dismay of Richard Vance. He managed a tight, strained smile when I passed him in the hallway, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. Since he could no longer attack me directly, he decided to attack my ability to do my job. 2 days later, Richard announced the implementation of a new, comprehensive change management framework. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, disguised under the guise of increased operational oversight and risk mitigation. According to the new policy, any modification to the infrastructure, no matter how minor or routine, required a formal risk assessment document, peer review, and final approval from a designated committee led by Richard himself. This is completely unworkable, I told the technical director during a private meeting. He is demanding a 48-hour approval window for routine patches. If we have a critical vulnerability, waiting 2 days to deploy a fix is professional negligence. I know, David, the director sighed, rubbing his temples. But Richard pitched this to the board as a necessary step to prevent another outage like the one we had in Chicago. He spun the narrative, claiming that unauthorized changes were the root cause, ignoring the fact that his own cost-cutting orders caused the failure. He has the board terrified of unapproved modifications. I realized then that Richard was playing a long game. He wanted to trap me in red tape, slow down my response times, and manufacture a scenario where my inability to fix a problem quickly could be blamed on my failure to follow protocol. He was setting me up to take the fall for his impending disasters. I went home that evening and discussed the situation with Sarah. He is building a paper trail, she observed, reviewing the new change management policy documents I had brought home. He is creating a system where you are guaranteed to fail. If you follow the rules, the systems will crash due to delayed maintenance. If you bypass the rules to save the systems, he will terminate you for insubordination. Exactly, I agreed. So how do I fight a bureaucratic trap? You use the law and you use compliance, she said with a sharp smile. Nexus handles financial data. You are subject to strict regulatory requirements regarding data security and uptime. If his policies deliberately expose the company to known security vulnerabilities, he is violating industry compliance standards. You need to document every instance where his policy delays a critical security patch, and you need to frame it as a severe regulatory risk. I started immediately. The next day, I submitted a change request to apply a routine security patch to our external-facing payment gateways. The patch addressed a known vulnerability that was actively being exploited in the wild. Under normal circumstances, I would have deployed it during the midnight maintenance window. Under Richard's new policy, I had to submit the paperwork and wait. I sent the request with a high-priority flag, explicitly stating in the documentation that delaying the patch exposed the company to a severe risk of data breach. Richard predictably rejected the request. He claimed the documentation lacked a sufficiently detailed rollback plan and demanded a revised submission. I did not argue. I revised the submission, adding another 5 pages of overly detailed rollback procedures, and resubmitted it. The delay stretched to 3 days. During that time, I monitored the external firewalls relentlessly. We were seeing active probing attempts targeting the exact vulnerability the patch was designed to fix. I compiled the firewall logs, the original security advisory, and Richard's rejection emails. I drafted a formal memorandum to the technical director, the chief information security officer, and the legal department. I used the language Sarah had suggested, outlining how the deliberate delay of critical security patches in a financial institution was a severe compliance violation and potentially a breach of fiduciary duty by operations leadership. I noted that should a breach occur, during this artificial delay, the liability would be astronomical. The response was immediate. Within 2 hours, the Chief Information Security Officer bypassed the entire Change Management Committee, granted emergency authorization for the patch, and demanded a meeting with Richard. The patch was deployed successfully that night, but the war was far from over. The security patch incident embarrassed Richard deeply, and he retaliated the only way a petty executive knows how, by filing a formal grievance with Human Resources. I was summoned to a meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. The room contained Richard, a senior human resources representative named Helen, and myself. Richard looked incredibly smug, sitting with his hands folded neatly on the table. David, we are here today to discuss a pattern of insubordination and unprofessional conduct, Helen began, consulting a thick file folder. Director Vance has documented several instances where you have actively bypassed approved operational procedures, communicated aggressively with leadership, and created a hostile environment for the managed service provider team. I kept my expression completely neutral. I would like to hear the specific allegations, please, with dates and supporting evidence. Richard cleared his throat. Let us start with the Chicago outage. You were actively uncooperative when informed of your contract expiration, threatening to abandon the remediation effort unless your demands were met. You then proceeded to overwhelm the incoming service provider with unnecessary technical jargon to intentionally sabotage their transition. Furthermore, last week, you deliberately bypassed the Change Management Committee to deploy an unapproved security patch, demonstrating a complete disregard for operational oversight. I let him finish. I took a slow, deep breath, reached into my briefcase, and pulled out my own folder. It was 3 times the thickness of Helen's. Helen, what Director Vance is describing is a carefully constructed fiction designed to cover up his own gross incompetence and retaliate against me for reporting his compliance violations. I opened my folder and began sliding documents across the table. Exhibit A, network logs and email directives proving that the Chicago outage was caused directly by Director Vance, ordering the deactivation of critical failover systems to artificially reduce his quarterly budget spend. Exhibit B, the email thread from the night of the outage, proving that he attempted to terminate my emergency access while the company was losing $95,000 an hour. I did not threaten to abandon the effort. I demanded written authorization to continue working after he explicitly told me I was fired. Helen's eyes widened as she reviewed the documents. Richard's smug expression began to falter. Exhibit C, I continued, my voice steady and commanding. The training logs and signed acknowledgments from the managed service provider team, confirming that I provided them with comprehensive, accurate documentation. Their inability to manage the network is due to their lack of enterprise experience, a factor Director Vance ignored when he hired the cheapest vendor available. And finally, Exhibit D, the memorandum from the Chief Information Security Officer, explicitly authorizing the security patch because Director Vance's artificial delays were exposing the company to a massive data breach and severe regulatory penalties. I leaned forward, looking directly at Helen. This is textbook retaliation. He is filing baseless complaints because I documented his compliance failures. I have already consulted with my attorney regarding the persistent harassment and the creation of a hostile work environment. Furthermore, if Nexus attempts to discipline me for preventing a major security breach, we will be discussing violations of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, whistleblower protections, as I escalated a significant risk involving financial data security to the legal department. The room fell dead silent. Helen looked from the documents to Richard, her expression hardening. Richard, you did not include these emails regarding the failover deactivation in your initial report. They are out of context, Richard sputtered, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. This is a technical disagreement, and he is trying to weaponize it. It is not a disagreement when the facts are documented in the system logs, I stated calmly. I suggest Human Resources conduct a full, independent audit of the decisions leading up to the Chicago outage, as well as a review of the risks introduced by the current change management policy. Until then, I will not entertain any further baseless accusations regarding my professionalism. I stood up, packed my briefcase, and walked out of the room. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but also a deep sense of satisfaction. I had not just defended myself. I had systematically dismantled his entire narrative using the very documentation he tried to ignore. The fallout was swift and decisive. By Wednesday morning, the Human Resources grievance against me had been quietly dismissed. The Change Management Committee was restructured, and Richard's unilateral veto power was revoked. The technical director and the chief information security officer were given joint authority over all infrastructure modifications. Richard had tried to build a cage for me, and he had ended up locking himself inside it instead. However, a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Richard knew his reputation was severely damaged, and he needed a massive victory to salvage his position within the company. 2 weeks later, he unveiled his masterpiece, a comprehensive plan to consolidate our remaining regional data centers into a single, massive cloud-based architecture, managed entirely by a new, highly expensive offshore vendor. He presented it to the board as the ultimate modernization initiative, promising millions in long-term savings and unparalleled efficiency. It was a beautiful presentation, full of buzzwords and optimistic projections. It was also From an engineering standpoint, absolute madness. The consolidation project was a ticking time bomb. Richard had aggressive timelines that completely ignored the reality of migrating legacy financial databases. He was pushing to move petabytes of highly sensitive, constantly updating transaction data across a new network architecture without proper parallel testing. I submitted a formal, 20-page risk analysis detailing exactly why the migration plan was dangerous. I highlighted the lack of data integrity checks, the insufficient bandwidth allocated for the initial transfer, and the extreme risk of database corruption if the synchronization was interrupted. I sent it to Richard, the technical director, and the entire executive board. Richard dismissed it publicly. He claimed my analysis was overly cautious and rooted in an outdated understanding of modern cloud capabilities. He assured the board that his new vendor had guaranteed a seamless transition. The board, mesmerized by the projected cost savings, approved the project. I was officially sidelined, relegated to maintaining the existing legacy systems while Richard's team focused entirely on the migration. I did not complain. I simply maintained the old systems perfectly, kept my documentation updated, and waited for the inevitable disaster. The catastrophe occurred on the first major migration weekend in late November. The plan was to move the primary transaction databases for 3 of our largest banking clients over a 48-hour window. I was at home enjoying a quiet Saturday evening with Sarah and our son Leo, who was visiting from college. At roughly 9 o'clock, my phone began to ring incessantly. It was not Richard, it was the technical director, and he sounded absolutely frantic. "David, we have a massive problem. The data migration failed halfway through. The synchronization broke, and the vendor tried to force a restart without clearing the cache. We have widespread data corruption across the active databases for 3 major banks. Transactions are failing, accounts are showing incorrect balances, and the vendor is completely unresponsive. We need you online immediately." I walked into my home office, powered on my workstation, and logged into the emergency bridge. The situation was worse than I could have imagined. It was not just a network outage, it was data corruption. If financial data is corrupted, you do not just lose money, you lose the trust of the banks, and you face catastrophic legal and regulatory consequences. The offshore vendor had completely botched the database locking mechanism during the transfer, resulting in thousands of overwritten and scrambled transaction records. I took immediate control of the call. "Everyone stop exactly what you are doing," I commanded over the bridge. "Do not attempt to restart the migration. Do not attempt to reverse it. Sever the connection to the new cloud environment immediately. If we sever the connection, we lose all the progress," Richard's voice chimed in, sounding panicked and defensive. "There is no progress, Richard. There is only corrupted data," I snapped, abandoning all pretense of corporate politeness. "We are currently polluting our primary databases with bad records. Disconnect the bridge now, or I am escalating this to the CEO and the federal regulators." The connection was severed. I spent the next 14 hours engaged in the most grueling technical rescue mission of my entire career. I had to isolate the corrupted sectors, identify the exact timestamp of the synchronization failure, and initiate a highly complex rollback procedure using the localized legacy backups that Richard had deemed obsolete. It required running custom scripts to manually verify the integrity of every single transaction that had occurred in the 4 hours prior to the failure. By noon on Sunday, I had managed to stabilize the databases and restore data integrity. The damage was contained, but the cost was staggering. The banks had experienced 12 hours of degraded service, and the entire migration project was a total loss. The aftermath was swift and brutal. An emergency board meeting was convened on Monday morning. I was asked to present a technical summary of the failure. I did not gloat, and I did not point fingers. I simply presented the facts, the server logs, and a copy of the risk analysis I had submitted 2 months prior, which perfectly predicted every single thing that had gone wrong. Richard tried to blame the vendor, claiming they had misrepresented their capabilities. But the technical director stepped in, producing emails showing that Richard had ignored warnings from internal engineering and pushed the vendor to bypass standard testing protocols to meet his arbitrary deadlines. The breach of fiduciary duty was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a reality that had just cost the company millions in penalties and shattered their reputation with key clients. Richard Vance was escorted out of the building by security that same afternoon. His termination was immediate, and there was no severance package. The board scrapped the consolidation project and authorized a massive budget increase to properly modernize the infrastructure using internal teams and careful, phased approaches. I was promoted to the position of Chief Infrastructure Architect, a role that reported directly to the CEO, with complete autonomy over the technical direction of the company. It took us nearly 2 years to clean up the mess Richard had left behind, but we built a system that was robust, secure, and genuinely modern. I look back on that night in Chicago, staring at the flashing red screens at 2:15 in the morning, and I realize it was the defining moment of my career. I could have walked away when he fired me. I could have let the systems burn. But by staying, by documenting everything, and by holding the line against toxic incompetence, I not only saved the company, but I also secured my own future. Sometimes, the best revenge is not walking away. It is standing your ground, doing your job perfectly, and letting the arrogant fools engineer their own spectacular downfall. It is a lesson I will never forget, and one that Nexus Financial Data will certainly always remember.